Hey guys, my name is Alex Steeno. I'm one of the founders of the Cowork Experience here. I'm also a senior leader for a tech unicorn too in marketing and growth. And this is my good friend David Shapiro.
Thank you for having me, Alex. David Shapiro, I'm a real estate investor and entrepreneur, realtor here in town, and I'm excited to speak to you guys.
In addition to the co-working day, and especially Friday afternoon, we're all kind of winding down anyways. So I feel like it was a really good opportunity to do that. And David Shapiro here is a really good friend of mine and a realtor in the area. And a lot of us, if you don't already own a home, have more than likely thought about buying a home. And one interesting aspect about this is kind of nowadays in the
8, 6, 2.
Wow, I don't know what that is. But can you turn that speaker off? So one of the things that I think is super relevant in today's environment is, people are no longer buying houses to just, move in with their significant other and 2 kids. It's, like, okay, so I want to buy this house, but, I kind of want to travel and I want to stay mobile and I want to stay lean. Do I really want to do that? There are a lot of hangups that people go through, and I personally thought a lot about buying a house in the last couple of years, and there's just so much that I haven't considered. And I mean, I traveled full time for a couple of years, and maybe I want to go back to that, maybe I don't. So there's so much that goes into the decision, and so I wanted to bring David in to actually go through some of that and talk through the use cases that people are doing in the modern environment, such as turning it into an investment property and how to think about that, or like turning the extra room into an Airbnb or the whole thing, and actually how to structure that out and what that actually looks like, so you're not necessarily committed. And a lot of us are probably renting in this case, and I think rent is poison. So, we'll talk through that. So, if you want to introduce yourself, we'll
cool.
Just let it flow.
I'm David Shapiro. Like you said, I'm a realtor, but more importantly, I'm an investor, and I got my start investing 13 years ago when I was 20 years old. I was in college, and the seed was planted about buying a house, and when I was 19, I just started trying to figure it all out, and there wasn't as much information available online, so I just kind of had to figure it out as I went. Would call a real estate agent, he would explain stuff, and call a lender, and figured it all out. And I wanted to own a home before I could legally drink. That was my goal. And so I just was determined, and that was my one focus for that year, and I made it happen. And at 20, when you own a home, the people's reactions are like, what? Why do you own a home? Because their perception of it is, well, when you have a family, you should own a home. So what are you doing? You're in college. Why do you own a home? And to me, it was really clear that I was going to live with roommates, and we were going to pay a combined $2,200 a month, let's call it. And so if I were to own the home, the mortgage would be like $1,500. So I could actually live there with 3 roommates and live for free. And so that's kind of been my thing for the last 13 years. For the most part, I have lived for free. And so if you can eliminate what's most people's biggest expense, which is housing, it gives you such a leg up on saving and investing. And so every year when most people are saying, okay, I'm going to spend $1,000 a month on rent, that's $12,000 for the year, that's an extra $12,000 I've been able to save for the last decade. And so that's really allowed me to continue to invest in real estate and expand. And before becoming a real estate agent, before ever earning over $100,000, I had acquired 5 properties. So it's not like I was making a ton of money. On average, I probably was only making like $50,000 a year. But I was really aggressive about saving. I had this huge benefit that my biggest expense was not an expense for me. And that allowed me to continue to invest in real estate. And so I think the goal here is to kind of, if somebody has something like a hang up over I don't know how long I'm going to live in Austin, or buying a home is expensive, try to remove any of those barriers so somebody can work towards buying their first property, or if they already own one, maybe get another one. And I just see it as such a great way to build wealth. If all somebody did was add 1 property to their portfolio, in Austin, if that's a $300,000 or $400,000 home, and sometimes people have a hard time thinking over 30 years, and that's something where I don't know, for whatever reason, I can just be 30 years in the future being like, okay, well, this house in 30 years will be $500,000 and it'll be paid off. But if you could add $500,000 to your net worth by retirement, this is an easy way to do that, where you get tenants, they pay the mortgage. And we were having this conversation yesterday about a house that I had bought. And you're like, okay, well, in the meantime, you had to pay the mortgage. And I was like, no. The tenants paid the mortgage. And so then 30 years from now, or in this case, it was a 5-year deal, but you have a house that's completely paid off. that you didn't put really any money into other than the down payment, and now it's worth $500,000 or whatever the number is that you can access.
So one question I have is, so I don't know about you guys, when I was 19 years old, I mean, investing wasn't really a thing for me. I came from a poor family. I don't think anybody really has any retirement. That I just didn't have this investing mindset. So where do you think this came in your life for you to actually, at the age of 19 with your undeveloped frontal lobe, sit down and be like, when I'm 30 years from now, I can actually see this. How do you think that happened for you?
Well, I was fortunate to land with a company called Cutco, and they, if you guys know,
sorry,
the knives,
I laugh.
the kitchen knives. So, I almost canceled my interview. I was like, this sounds sketchy, and the manager called me back, and it's a whole thing. I ended up there, and it was one of the best things that ever happened to me. And I spent 4 years with that company, and at 19, right after my 19th birthday, I found them, and they're talking about you guys should be reading books, read Rich Dad Poor Dad. And I had actually, my first summer with the company, so just 6 months into it, I'm on a plane back from Vegas because I'd won this company trip, and I'm sitting there reading Rich Dad Poor Dad, and the guy next to me, he's like, can I buy that from you? And I'm like, what? He's like, I want to buy your book. And I'm like, well, I'm in the middle of reading it. And he's like, no, I'm going to give you $20. He literally has a $20 bill in his hand. And when you're done reading it, I want you to donate it to a local library or give it to a friend or something, because I want you to spread the word. Because at 19 years old, or you didn't know my age at that point, at your age, you could tell I was really young. The fact that you're reading Rich Dad, Poor Dad, I know you're going to go places. And someday, just repay the favor. So I think this guy, his name's Jerry. I've got the $20 bill framed at home, says Jerry's 20. And if I run into him, he's going to be like, all right, I need that plus interest. But it was just kind of a really, interesting experience. I was fortunate that I was in a place where reading Rich Dad Poor Dad at 19 was normal.
Wow, that's awesome. Harlan?
Might be my doppelganger.
Yeah.
I read Rich Dad Poor Dad at 19.
Yeah?
Dropped out of school at 20. Bought my first house at 21. Then bought 5 houses. That book changed my life.
Yeah, that book's amazing. And if you haven't read it, I'd suggest reading it as a starting point. But one of the fundamental takeaways for me, and maybe you can weigh in on one for you, was that the difference between an asset and a liability. And he breaks down pretty simply. An asset is something that puts money in your pocket. A liability is something that takes money away from you. So most people will say, my home is my biggest asset. But if all you do is spend money living there, then it's not really an asset. And I think this conversation is about how can you turn what's a liability for a lot of people, which is just a monthly mortgage payment, into an asset through Airbnb-ing a room, leaving occasionally and Airbnb-ing the whole house, getting some roommates. And this has been referred to as house hacking, which I love that term. And I've done all of these ways. I've had roommates, I've Airbnb'd, I've done them in combination. One time I had 2 roommates. It was costing me about $200 a month to live in the house. And I said to my roommates, hey, I got an idea. And this is back in 2013. What if we Airbnb it? And you guys both have girlfriends. You just go stay with your girlfriends. And they're like, yeah, we would do that anyways. And so it was really an experiment for me. I took a $100 fee as the manager, and then we split everything 3 ways. And at the end of all that, we did it maybe once a month. And now that $200 a month that I was spending to live there turned into a net of $400 a month or so on average. It probably was even more. So now what was an expense of $200 a month, now this property, I'm living there for free, and it's making me money, and it's appreciating. And that's the other crazy thing that we've touched upon a little bit, is the appreciation in Austin has been solid. It's been 5% a year, different for different areas. And a question I get a lot, which might be on your mind, is well, this thing's been going straight up for 9 years. Should I wait for it to crash or correct or whatever word you want to use? Well, in the recession, 2008, 2010, single-family homes in Austin dropped 4%. And we've seen roughly 5% appreciation per year since. So if you're waiting for this big drop, well, if it would have to be bigger than the greatest recession of our lifetimes for it to exceed something that even makes sense for you to try to time. It's really hard to time markets, so trying to time for a 4% drop is probably not the best idea, because then you miss out on 1, 2, 3 years of 5% appreciation. So dollar cost averaging is something they use in the stock market, something I think is good to incorporate into real estate investing.
That's amazing. That's such a good point. I think it's so funny. And as like full disclosure, David's also my realtor. And we went through the data too. And I think that was just so remarkable to see that when everything, I mean, what was the national average of like housing drop? I know people that lost like 40% of their portfolio on the stock market in like years, right? And I'm sure housing probably follows a similar trend.
And it's interesting being in Austin because we kind of are in a bubble. And any urban market in this country has recovered and then some. And you hear the stories about San Francisco and other Seattle, big cities. And we're in that boat. But only like half the country is recovered from the housing crash. So there's still parts of the country where they have not reached those peaks again. And that just points to the re-urbanization of the country and everybody trying to be close to the city. And everybody I talk to, their goal is to be as close to downtown Austin as possible.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think that, you know, should we hit another crash, Austin will probably be not nearly as affected again like other cities around the world, with Apple putting $1 billion campus here. It's just like basic economics of supply and demand, right? Where it's I think it's going to follow suit. So I think that's interesting. You said something cool about, so I've never read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, but I think that assets and liabilities, and thinking about almost everything I do, I frame in terms of assets and liabilities. So when I'm spending my free time, do I exercise? Do I eat right? You know, is this an asset to my health? Is this an asset to my body? I think about that a lot, and I think that's one thing that I suppose we as modern professionals, the slew of us, can do a lot better, is adopt that mentality, not just for money, but for however we spend our time. I think that's one thing I just wanted to touch on. So David said earlier that you know, if anybody's thinking about buying a house or something, or any hang-ups you might have about that or concerns, I have some of mine, but I'd love to hear from you guys. So it's literally not just David and I talking and you guys listening. Does anybody considering buying a house right now? You don't have to be actively shopping or anything like that.
I have a girlfriend that was looking about investing in a condo or some kind of housing for her daughter that's going to be going to college, and she's just like, oh my God, I don't even think they're going to be able to afford it when they graduate. And so she's trying to look into how she can invest in real estate for her family long term.
So they're going to the students 18 now going to college?
I believe so, like in the next couple of years, that she's trying to solve that housing issue because she doesn't see that it makes sense to send them off, pay for rent for the next 4 or 5 years when she could have been earning equity in it, right?
Yeah, especially in a city like Austin. Now, the UT market's a little bit different and seems to act a little bit differently because there's like this, people are buying for 4 years, then selling them, and it probably works out as good, if not better, than renting. I haven't taken too much time to analyze it, but they could get a house just east of 35, still a bike ride over to campus in a neighborhood where your buyers aren't only students. And so then when they go to exit in 4 years or 6 years, they can take that as a profit. And this kind of comes to, somebody had asked me about, well, isn't there a way to like there's a tax benefit of buying and owning and all that? There's a couple, but one that I'll mention is that if you live in a house for 2 years and then go to sell it, you can walk away with up to $250,000 in profit, tax-free. So if you buy, and I'm going to use $400,000 as like our example throughout this if we need to use one. So you buy a $400,000 house, you live there for a couple of years, let's say it's worth $440,000. So you sell it, you walk away, and just to keep it simple, obviously there's expenses with selling, but let's say you walk away with $40,000 in profit. Normally you'd have to pay capital gains tax, which is usually 15%. So that would be $6,000 that you don't have to pay because you lived there for 2 years. Now, if you're married, it's up to $500,000. So, no, that's nationwide. Yeah. So,
and also, why would they not want to promote like people living in houses longer?
Well, I guess they're promoting that you stay in a house more than 2 years.
Right.
So, like, why not make it a 3-year or 4-year hurdle? I'm not sure. I don't know how the IRS came up with these things.
I don't think anybody knows a lot about why the IRS does anything.
Yeah, I do listen to a lot of podcasts about this stuff, like Planet Money and The Indicator are awesome, and they often will get into like the history of this stuff, like of the income tax, and how it started after whatever war because the government didn't have enough money, and those things I always find interesting, but I haven't heard on that one though.
So how do you cover the down payment? Because that's what keeps people from doing house life
Yeah, how do you cover the down payment? Good question. So there are down payment assistance programs in Austin where the city will even throw in some money. You pay a higher interest rate, so depending on the person, if they have the down payment, it's often better they just pay it and they get the lower interest rate, especially if they're going to be there more than a couple of years. But there's all sorts of programs to do that. If you're a veteran, you can put 0% down with a VA loan. We just had a guy buy. He actually closed today, and he put nothing down. I haven't had a chance to talk to him and figure out what his lender did, but he did an ARM, which is an adjustable rate mortgage, because he wasn't planning on being in the home for more than...
Sorry, I literally thought his down payment was an ARM.
It's Friday.
Yeah, sorry. No, Friday afternoons, my brain. No, like putting it up as collateral. Like, if I can't pay my loan, like, yeah, dude, just take my arm. It's probably worth
Oh,
something.
he didn't detach it proactively.
Oh.
They'll come get it if he defaults. Repo man for the arm.
Yeah. Sorry, maybe in 100 years we'll have that.
Yeah. Just pledge an arm. So it's an adjustable rate, but the rate came in at like 3.375%. Yeah, pretty damn good. And he put down nothing. He actually walked away from closing because we negotiated a credit. Yeah. So when I talked to him, and I wasn't like, hey, did you wire the money? He was like, hey, did you get your check yet?
Wow, that's pretty funny.
Yeah, it's not, some people are like, oh my God, does that mean we're back to 2008? No, it's not the same. These are not subprime borrowers. I got a loan in 2006, by the way, at 19 years old, and I just signed. Like, yeah. So now I was...
Did you have a good job?
No, I mean, I sold Cutco knives.
Oh, yeah.
I had 1 year of track record selling knives.
Were you a subprime mortgage? Because I was.
I'm pretty sure I was, yeah.
I got a no document. I was a waiter. I had no proven document. My boss wrote a letter that says, I promise not to fire Harlan. and he makes 30 grand a year in tips, so we can't prove it because it's cash.
Yeah.
And then I borrowed the money for down payment from another bank. They didn't even do the math.
Yeah, it's crazy back then. So we're
Mates paid my mortgage.
so we were prudent about the decision. So some people maybe weren't as good with their numbers and understood it, but we're not back to that, by the way. Although sometimes it feels like we're starting to get closer, and there's now like a non-qualified loan or something, which is just another term for it's getting closer to subprime. But they can't use that term anymore.
If I keep in mind, for a first-time home buyer, the government will do anything to get you in a home. Still, 3% down or less. Mm-hmm. They want you to get a home. They don't want you to not get a home. So take advantage of that first try. And if you move out in 2 years, just keep having your mail sent there for a year. I'm serious.
So
people live there and collect your mail.
we've all learned that Harlan is an expert in gray area. So if you need help navigating things that you might not want to navigate, Harlan's your man.
So until you started talking, I had no plans to buy a home. I'm moving back to San Francisco in a month.
Okay.
And basically I'm trying to figure out a strategy. I want to be in a beach town, and that's about all I know. And,
Okay.
So I'm like, how do I even go about beginning the home searching process?
Yeah, good question. I always recommend starting by finding a real estate agent that you can trust, that can help guide you, that's open to taking a little bit extra time to maybe educating and helping you figure out what the right strategy is. Somebody that's resourceful would be good and has some experience in some of these alternative ways to make it work. Because even if you could afford, let's say the bank will qualify you for a mortgage, you're like, okay, I get it, I qualify for this $4,000 a month mortgage, but I don't want to pay that. Like, how can I be creative about doing that? And I just helped a client, and the thing that I brought up to them, I was like, this house would be awesome for Airbnb. You could just do it a couple times a year even, South by ACL, and probably generate $12,000 for the year. At least that covers your property taxes. And they're like, that's awesome. And hey, we have a kid. We're probably going to be out of town during South by anyways. And there is a cool another tax loophole that if you short-term rental your house for less than 14 days for the year, the IRS will let you keep that tax-free. So that's
South by 13 days, $1,000 a night.
Yep, exactly.
That's pretty quick math.
Yeah. Also the South by loophole, we can just call it.
Yeah. It's a golf loophole. It was named after a golf tournament.
Oh, really?
That's where that came from. I can't remember the name of it.
It actually has a name. Okay.
Yes, it does have a name. That loophole.
That's so funny.
but so to answer your question, like start there. There's a really good forum called Bigger Pockets. It's intended for real estate investors, but if you're looking for out-of-the-box, resourceful things, you can go into the forums and just spend hours searching through and seeing what other people have talked about. Any question you've probably asked, there's probably an answer on there on how to do it. And man, we can get super creative. Like the couple that I'm referencing with the Airbnb, we actually started looking for a rental for them. And we went to go look at one of the houses. They really liked it. And I just kind of threw the idea out there to the owner. I was like, hey, what do you think about owner financing? She's like, I don't know how that works. And I explained it to her. I showed her how she was going to get I think she ended up getting an offer for $3,900 a month in rent. And the way that we set up the owner financing, she's going to also get $3,900 a month, except the new owners, so it'll no longer be her, are going to pay the taxes, the insurance, all the maintenance, and they're going to be responsible for she doesn't have any responsibility for vacancy. So this deal is way better for her because it's stress-free. She ends up with more money, and it's way better for my clients because now they get to buy the home. They get the possible appreciation down the road, which I certainly see is going to continue here in Austin. They get a beautiful home. They don't have to move in a year or 2 years when their lease is up. There's just a lot that comes with home ownership. And this is just kind of like a side thought that came to my mind that how many people here own a home? Okay, cool. So if you don't own a home, this is going to sound really weird, but once you do, you'll get it. I remember I was 20 years old when this happened, so it was even funnier, but I used to work home shows for Cutco. And me and a good buddy, he was like 21, we're at the booth of this home show, and I'm like, dude, can you hold down the booth for a few minutes? I saw these really badass rain gutter covers. I got to go check them out. and he's just like, what is wrong with you? And I like run over there and I'm like, oh my God, these things are so cool. And you're like checking out the expandable ladders, like all these things that you never thought you would think are cool. My garage door opener failed the other day and I had to get a new one. And now I'm just like sitting there like hitting the garage, I'm like, wow, it's so quiet. Like those little things that just all of a sudden amp you up over owning a home and like the pride of ownership, coming home to it, getting to do whatever you want to it. I always like the fact that when the 1 year mark hits, I'm not worried about my lease and where am I going, and like you just leave whenever you want. One hang up people have about buying a home is it's a really big commitment, and it is in a sense, but I honestly get more anxiety, and maybe that's because other than living in one dorm, which I don't know if you consider that a rental. I didn't sign a lease. You just kind of part of going to college. I had owned before I actually had signed a lease, so maybe that's part of why I'm more comfortable doing it. But I feel like leasing is more of a commitment because you're stuck with 12 months. You're at the landlord's mercy of what happens. If you buy and a month later you're like, you know what, this was a mistake. You can turn it into a rental property. You can turn it into an Airbnb. You can go ahead and sell it if you want. You'd probably lose money, but I guess you play devil's advocate to myself here. What amount you might lose on that sale, you'd probably be the same as if you just paid your rent for the entire year and didn't live there or whatever. But so they both have their restrictions. Limitations is the word I'm looking for.
I really feel the lease thing so much. That's like I hate renting. I've always hated renting in my life. Even like as a college student, I was trying to figure out how I could like buy a home, but I didn't know anything about this. And so I did a lot of traveling for a couple of years. And before I moved to Austin about 5 months ago, I lived in Miami. And so I lived in this like super awesome apartment downtown. And I'm like, yes, I'm going to live in Miami. And I was super gung-ho about it. So I signed a 12-month lease. And, a couple months in, I was like, man, Miami sucks to live in. And then I'm like, dude, how do I leave, because like my rent was expensive. It was downtown Miami. And I tried to sublease it on Craigslist. And I'm like, all the people that I was interviewing were all like weirdos from Craigslist. And I mean, I'm lucky. I have a lot of Craigslist successes. Harlan is my roommate. I met him on Craigslist. It's awesome living together. And but I tried to do that, and it was terrible. And I ended up trying to Airbnb it to see like if I could do a test and see if it made sense to just like keep it on the only lose, like a couple $100 a month on Airbnb. But then again, my apartment building like came after me. I don't know if they have a web scraper that just immediately knew it. They're like, we know you're Airbnb-ing, and you're going to get evicted. Jesus Christ. And so, it's like the same thing. I ended up having to pay almost $4,000 to break that lease, and I don't think all apartments have to do that. And I'm like, man, I really wish I would have just even in Austin, I don't even want to sign a year lease, and I'd rather just buy something, honestly.
Yeah. And that situation, like you could have just Airbnb'd it if you owned it, right?
Yeah,
so like,
absolutely.
And then it would have been profitable.
Correct.
And one hang up I think people have is, well, I don't know how long I'm going to be here, like in Austin or wherever it might be in California. And I think it doesn't really matter if you're buying correctly and keeping that in mind that you may not be there long term, making sure you're buying a place that when you do turn around to turn it into a rental, that it'll rent for more than what the mortgage payment is, whether it's through Airbnb, which almost always would exceed a mortgage payment, or long-term rental. And I always like to have multiple exit strategies. So I don't like to be restricted to like, it has to do this or it's not going to work. So Airbnb could be an option. Long-term rental could be an option. Maybe there's renovation or development potential. I love those plays where maybe the house is a little bit older. I can rent it as is without doing upgrades. But hey, down the road, I could always renovate it or even just tear it down and build new. And there's a profitable strategy that way. So having multiple strategies. But knowing kind of, okay, I may not be in Austin forever, but let me plan this out so it's in an area that would be good for an Airbnb. And there's also people have limiting beliefs on that. Like, oh, I have to be near Zilker, I have to be on the east side, really close to downtown for it to be a good Airbnb. So that was broken for me when a friend of mine, like way up in Northwest Austin, was Airbnb-ing her house, and people would still go. It had a pool, it was kind of like a cool little getaway, and it was more affordable. The house was less expensive for her to buy, and therefore the Airbnb rent could be lower, and she still was profitable. The house that I did it with, the two roommates, was down off of William Cannon. And people would still come and stay there for ACL. They're not the people that could afford to be walking distance to Zilker. And they would still come, they stay there, they go out and party other places. So it doesn't have to be right downtown is another thing to do Airbnb. But I think it's a good opportunity because the best financing and the lowest down payment is going to be if you buy owner occupied. So sometimes people come to me and they're like, okay, I already own a house, now I want to buy an investment. And that can be a limitation of like, well, now you need 20% down or sometimes even 25% down versus to buy owner occupied, you can get away with 3% down. And I usually recommend people 5%, 10%, something like that. So you get much better terms, you get a lower interest rate because you're a lower risk. Because if you look at it from a bank's perspective, is somebody more likely to walk away from an investment that's a rental there's no emotional attachment to, or their home? So they're much more likely to make those payments on their home no matter what than on a rental. So you get a slightly lower interest rate because you're a better risk. And so keeping that in mind, and so that's why 3 of my properties I have purchased owner-occupied and moved into them. And then some other ones, straight investments, but the terms weren't as good. I had to put down 25% on one of them. And that is fine. I still made money, but it kills your return on investment from just like a straight IRR, like numbers percentage. And so I'll finish up on the limitation. So like how long am I going to live here, I think is one. Where do I come up with the down payment? So just knowing you can do as little as like 3% down. FHA is 3.5% down right now, and that's a good program. And then these grants, potentially you get somebody else to come in and pay that. You can accept a gift for your down payment from a close friend or family member, and they don't question that. And so it's pretty common. I know if it was me right now trying to buy my first home, I would have a hang up over trying to ask my parents for money to help with it. But just so you guys know, it's very common. That happens all the time. And there's some people, like if you have some sort of like pride of like, I'm going to do this on my own, I think that's great. That's how I am. But I think it's better to get into a home sooner and accept some money from a family member rather than waiting, mostly because appreciation. And I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know if it's going to continue at this rate. But what I'm seeing from the fundamentals of supply and demand here is that jobs are coming. I don't know if you guys know, but Google leased an entire building downtown that hasn't even been built yet. 30 stories.
That's funny.
Block 71.
Yeah. Facebook announced 12-story building at the Domain they're going to lease. Of course, the Apple campus, Oracle's building phase 2. These are just the big names that we've heard of. And then there's lots of small companies that I'm meeting with these people all the time. They're like, hey, we're, for tax reasons. I don't know how many people have moved here from California and New York for tax reasons. And I feel like when you narrow the list to places you can go, it's like, am I going to go to Miami, Puerto Rico, or Austin, Texas?